Welcome to the New Voices. I'm Jim Lane, Biofuels Digest, and tonight we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of hot topics. Gas stations, are they ever going to change, or are we going to have the same infrastructure for the rest of time? We're going to look at indirect land use change. What is it? We're not quite sure, but we're going to find out. And we're also going to look at chemicals versus fuels. Why make a $2 fuel when you can make a $5 chemical, as we look at gas stations and infrastructure? We've been seeing the gas station has kind of been around for a while. 1907, the first one was founded. It was pretty simple at the time, but you basically pulled up and there was a pump and you got gasoline. And here it is, 2015, 108 years later, and we've got all these new materials and all these new fuels and all this new science, and you pull up to the gas station and there's a pump and you get gasoline. Is it ever going to change?
Right.
And what will make it happen?
Well, you know, gasoline stations have changed some, and you forget that convenience stores have gotten more diversity of snacks and sodas and just gotten more elaborate over time.
Yeah, that part of the store is doing great.
Yeah. So, but when you come to the actual fueling part, the reason you probably arrived at the station, things have stayed the change, really haven't changed over a century.
A little bit of unleaded in there. So we took the lead out at some point.
Changed it up a little bit, and now you can clean your windshield wipers and, you know, your windshield. But, you know, what's exciting to see and the innovation that's taking place are companies like Propel. So you start to think about the fueling station of the future. It's actually happened now, where they offer renewable fuels and other types of fuels as well. So you see a Propel station, they're side by side with the normal gas station, but they offer biodiesel, higher grades of ethanol. And so it's exciting to see that this diversification in the offerings. But you're also seeing a shift in really how people refuel. So you think about EV charging stations. They aren't necessarily at a gas station. You see them in company parking lots, in shopping centers.
They're talking about putting them at motels as well. That's like the new thing, and it's apparently an easier thing because obviously it doesn't catch fire in the same way that, you know, a fuel thing has to be highly regulated.
So you're starting to see this distributed fuel or distributed energy centers where you can get at different places. You're also seeing, when you think of the commercial side, a lot of these fleets aren't going to the stations that we normally go to. They refuel on site, and you have this distributed fueling. And that gives opportunities for, so you see the city fleets. Many of them run on CNG, and they'll come back to their base, and that's where they refuel every night. And you start to see this distributed production as well as distributed consumption of fuels, and that's exciting to see. So it's really shifting the business model as well as how people refuel.
You know, Elon Musk has been doing this, building out a whole new network. It's tough to do. I mean, you not only have to be a visionary like he is, but you have to have, you know, finance, and you have to have logistics and stuff. What, you know, is it only one or two people, you know, going to be able to pull this off, or is anybody?
You can't. 80% of gas stations in the US are owned by individuals, and they are building them to make money, and you can make money from selling fossil fuels. They're not going to install an EV charger for a few $1,000s if they can't make money from it, which means they need to have at least 10 visits a day. And at the moment, this is fast charging, at the moment there aren't enough, you know, like Tesla cars, for instance, or other vehicles, to have that. With hydrogen stations, if you were installing hydrogen in your gas station.
What's a fast charge these days? How fast is a fast charge? I mean, they used to be kind of slow, but they're getting a lot faster. Right?
So Tesla says about 20 minutes. That's not a full charge, that's enough that you really need, but that's their specific superchargers, and you're right. What Tesla are doing across Europe is installing these superchargers, but they're making a loss. They're doing it to try and encourage the sales of the vehicles.
Rebecca, you know, you kind of work on fleet side change. Is it easy? It's easier, I assume, to change a fleet over, or is it harder?
Well, most fleets, it depends on the delivery style or the routes that fleets do. So one way for fleets to change is really on the regional haul is the easiest to change today, right? So you have trucks that go from coast to coast, so you have long haul, the heavy duty trucking, and so those are the biggest challenge because they need fuel all the way across the U.S. if we're just looking at the U.S. here to travel. But if you look at regional fleets, I mentioned earlier CNG for buses, but these are fleets that go in and out of the same terminal every day or a limited number of terminals. And those are easier to convert to another fuel because they're coming home at night, and so they have their fueling capabilities at home. And so as we've worked on the rollout of DME, we've been engaging with regional haul fleets because they can go out and come home and refuel with DME at their site, and they can control that. And most fleets prefer to control their own fueling because they buy in bulk, they get a discount, they control the infrastructure, they own that, there's not a time limit on it. And so it's ideal for them to be able to refuel on site. So I think alternative fuels, and you've seen the same case in other fuels, engaging with those doing regional haul is a great way to start. And as those fleets and those networks start to grow, you get new networks across the country, and eventually you can build out, connect the dots and build out a long haul fueling infrastructure as well.
So Claire, when you're looking at technology and you're looking at the barriers to technological cost barriers, technical readiness barriers, how much is infrastructure is that the biggest problem out there in terms of widespread adoption, or just one of the things that gets solved?
I think when we look at advanced or next generation biofuels, one of the main perks is they are drop-ins. A lot of them are cellulosic diesel, cellulosic gasoline. There is no issue with infrastructure. When you look at things like hydrogen cars, electric vehicles, natural gas vehicles, I think that's probably the biggest issue. I mean, hydrogen, as an example, theoretically a great fuel, but you need to build a station. It could cost you $2 or $3 million compared to a $1 million gasoline station, and there's no cars on the road. Maybe there's going to be 400 in California at the end of this year.
So change is hard to change may not be so easy for certain selected technologies.
It's a chicken and egg problem.
Chicken and egg problem. So we're going to come back. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back. And we're going to look at a different type of change. We're going to talk about indirect land use change, which, unlike infrastructure change, looks like it's really easy to happen. So say the critics. We'll come back after this. Welcome back to The New Voices. I'm Jim Lane, Biofuels Digest, and we are about to get into one of the most abstruse and difficult issues in the whole world of renewable fuels. It's called indirect land use change. Eric, is there anything to it? Is there any data on that? What about indirect land use change?
There was a first generation.
And why do people, how do we measure it? Yeah.
What we're essentially trying to do is prevent global warming. You prevent global warming in the academic theory by not having additional carbon emissions into the sky. And we all know that the carbon under the ground in the form of petroleum, when you produce it and then refine it and then combust it, ends up as new CO2 and potentially methane.
In the sky.
In the sky. And so what we're trying to do here is have some formula that can say, how do we reduce the carbon emissions worldwide? And one of the ways to do it is to look at the base number of how much we're putting in the sky, emitting to the atmosphere by combusting petroleum. That's a baseline.
So that's your baseline,
exactly.
And that's just
and
basic
the baseline
gasoline.
calculation is roughly 96 or something. It's a reference number, because then you can measure how well you're doing as you select other fuels and you calculate the carbon intensity of the other fuels. You can figure out if it's a 50% reduction, then let's categorize that as being advanced biofuels. That happens to be.
And so you're adding up all the direct, things like any kind of carbon that's utilized in the production. Maybe
Correct.
if they're using that, you're using that gas or something like that.
And the indirect land use change concept in the ethanol business comprises over 30% of the actual carbon calculation. Is this academic concept that if you have an acre in Kansas that's been farmed for the last 100 years by a guy and his family, that every year that acre is farmed, there's an acre of Amazon rainforest that has to be taken out of production. Well, if you look forward theoretically 100 years from now, that means there's 100 acres of Amazon rainforest that's been knocked down so this one guy can drive his tractor on 1 acre. That was the first GREET model, which is the academic model, and had some flimsy academic concepts in there that didn't think long term. Now that the second go around, the academics have gone back and they've taken into consideration some of the real data we've had since the renewable fuel standards passed, for example, in 2007.
I think Google Earth is part of this whole project. Google's mapping the world, aren't they?
Exactly.
Looking for
they're
land use
taking
change.
real data about what really is happening in the rainforest when you continue to just grow the same acre in Kansas, and the answer is not very much. Same acre in Kansas is not taking an acre of Amazon rainforest out. What we've actually found is that the behavior in third world countries is what really matters. If we have indigenous peoples that do not have good agricultural practices, they're going to go knock down the jungle instead of going back to the land that they burned down 3 years ago. And so the indirect land use change theory has remained a theory. I think the data does not actually support that it even should exist. I think what we should see is that the actual carbon content of biofuels and gasoline are based upon their production and transportation and the eventual consumption, and that the indirect land use change, I believe, over the next 5 to 6 years is going to become sort of one of those funny things that happen early in biofuels. Now, that doesn't mean that biofuels are going to get any better. What I mean by that is, so biofuels now are half the carbon content. Well, they've always been half. If you get rid of this idea of ILUC, they've always been half. That doesn't mean our policies have to be any different. Policies can be exactly what they are today, incentivizing people to have lower carbon. I would say that what we're talking about is that the playing field is not even. If you make this ETOH molecule, which happens to stand for ethanol, then you're penalized with 30 carbon units. If you make this other molecule, you're not. It's an uneven playing field that was built by the academics who I think now are getting their models.
Now, this has
revised.
It's been cited as kind of a chilling effect with investors because it's yet another degree of uncertainty. Is that real, Claire? Do people really, I mean, is there, when investors look at this, is it really about carbon? Does it just come down to the economics?
I think it's about policy, and none of this would be an issue if it wasn't built into some policy schemes. You look at California, with direct land use change, corn ethanol is about 78, so it's better. It's now with indirect land use change, it's about 105-ish. So compared to what you were saying, gasoline at 95. So if you are an investor in corn ethanol, do you really care what its ILUC is? Maybe not. What you care about is the policy. And at the moment, they can't sell to California just because of this. They're penalised, irrespective of whether ILUC is real or not. And in Europe, the big thing with Europe is the government has been debating since 2009 whether they should include ILUC in their mandates. The mandate is 2020, and they're still debating. This year, they finally said, we're going to not include ILUC. We will after 2020, but after 2020, we're not going to. But this has been 5-6 years of investor, they've been frozen. There's been no investment in Europe. There's been no build-out, no next-gen. Just because the government hasn't decided one way or the other. That's, I think, the issue with the investors.
So we've been hearing a lot about government indecision. In the United States, the Renewable Fuel Standard, the Environmental Protection Agency has not yet actually declared a mandate for 2014. Now, here we are in 2015. So, Rebecca, you're out there raising money for an early stage venture. Is that a real issue? Those kinds of policy effects? Do people really look at that and say, you know what, until you get this sorted, we're very skeptical about the sector? Is that real?
Well, so we actually have one major investor, and so they believe this is a long-term play, and they understand that infrastructure is difficult to develop and it'll take time. So it doesn't affect us directly, but what does affect with just the general sentiment, I think for the industry is important to everyone, what's going on and how people feel things are going with the industry in general. And so that's where it is important for the stable policy side of things. Because, for example, we are looking at a variety of methane sources that we can convert to a chemical or a fuel. And so we can look at a biogas source. We can also look at pipeline natural gas. We can look at stranded gas. But using that biogas source is a much larger investment. So while it doesn't directly affect investment in our company, when we look at our projects, we know we're going to have to put a lot more capital up front to produce this renewable fuel. Long term, it's going to pay off. But how do you incentivize people to go for the renewable versus another feedstock because of the additional investment up front? So I think that's where the stability of policy is extraordinarily important, because you're putting a lot of capital into these projects.
So you've got all kinds of crazy going on potentially with different regimes looking at different things. So it's a little bit like maybe counting carbs in this case versus counting calories. Changes the kind of outcomes in terms of what food companies have to produce. So if it's all about low carb, they got to produce this, and low calorie, low fat, oops,
It also has a big impact on the emotional stability of policy. Why do we care about emotions? Investors are driven by emotions. When you're fearful, you don't make investments. Right now, we're all very fearful about the EPA. We're fearful about the White House. Why? Because they're not enforcing federal law. 2007, a 15-year policy called Renewable Fuel Standard was passed. November 1st of 2013, by federal law, we were supposed to know how much we were going to blend in 2014. That was almost 16 months ago. It's like somebody came in, robbed a federal bank. The bank called the police and nobody showed up. That went on every day for 16 months. I happen to own a federal bank. It's called an ethanol plant. The cops aren't showing up and enforcing federal law. How much confidence does that instill in the investors that fund the biofuels business? Not just ethanol, but DME and everything else. When you see that the rule of law no longer applies in this particular segment of the economy, I fundamentally think that policymakers need to know they're doing a contract with investors. And when you do a contract with investors and you breach your side of the contract, don't expect them to deliver.
Well, we'll be back after the break with Sheriff McAfee and the rest of the panel as we look at getting the cops to come to the rescue of the renewables industry. We're going to look at chemicals, we're going to look at fuels, why make one, why make another. We'll be back right after this with our guest, Ron Cascone of Nexen. Stay with us. Welcome back to the New Voices. I'm Jim Lane, Biofuels Digest. And in this segment, we're joined by our good friend we've had before on the show, Ron Cascone of Nexen, senior analyst there. And we're going to get Ron right away into the question of fuels versus chemicals. We've talked about food versus fuel, and is versus the wrong way to look at it? Should everything be an and, or is there really a versus there? Why make a $2 fuel when you can make a $5 chemical?
Why not make both?
Why not make both?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, there are a number of companies now that are developing what they call bioreformate. Now, that means, in a petroleum refinery.
Whoa. But what is bioreformate? That
Well,
sounds like a kind of a religious thing from the 16th century.
Right. Hang on.
It's a bio-Catholic.
That's true.
That's a
It does
versus as
sound
well.
like
So,
that, yes. The reformer, the catalytic reformer in a refinery is the engine that makes most of the gasoline.
They reform it. They actually
the good stuff
turn it
in
from
the
one
gasoline.
thing into another.
Right. There's an anecdote of one of the experimenters in this area, one of the developers in this area, having sent a sample of their bioreformate to an oil company for taking a look at. The oil company came back and said, "Oh, come on, please don't kid us around. You've taken this out of a refinery." And they said, "Okay, do the carbon-14 dating on it." And they did. And they came back and said, "You're right, it's all new carbon."
Oh, so they're doing carbon-14 testing. That's how they tell the difference between the new stuff and the old stuff. So,
Right.
that's how drop-in it is. You have to do a
There's an
carbon-14
ASTM test which is parallel to the carbon-14 testing that the paleoanthropologists use, which can tell you whether the carbon is from a plant or whether the carbon is from a fossil fuel. And so by doing
from fossil man, right?
well,
Probably the
fossil
same
man
test.
would have a pretty good carbon-14 rating.
There you go.
relatively new. So anyway, that is the case that you will be producing probably a lot of gasoline eventually. That's drop-in gasoline, and you would have the same ability to extract from that pool the feedstocks for chemical production that you do from refineries that are making petroleum reformate.
But this goes back to the whole biorefinery idea that was touted, 10 years ago? When companies, especially in Northern Europe, started coming up with these ideas, they thought we could make, fuels, chemicals, biomass, lignin, biogas from this one plant, and it's an interesting idea. And I don't think any of the investors really got on board because most of them just wanted one or two products you can sign off-takes for. They want the fuel or the power. The chemicals coming off, the lignin coming off, no one knew what to do with. And I think we're maybe seeing a bit of a circle. I think now investors are getting a bit cleverer. You've got strategic investors like chemicals companies who actually know what they're doing and know what these chemicals are. You're seeing people start to bring back this biorefinery idea. Maybe not that word, maybe that's dated, but the idea that you could produce 5 or 6 different products and it's not going to freak out the banks or the investors you've got because they now finally get it.
Yes,
So
even
maybe a
from-
more sophisticated version of some of the traditional ABCD processing companies that produce like a corn wet mill that produces zillions of products.
Right.
Yeah.
So different set of outcomes, but not a completely different model. Do we see another Cargill in the making someday, or is that possible? Eric, how big can it go?
I would say that's the way it's working. What's happening is that these specialty chemicals, especially renewable specialty chemicals, do have an opportunity to have an offtake agreement. The biofuels business is built on the idea there is no such thing as an offtake agreement. Literally, I don't know what the price of ethanol tomorrow is. Whereas in the solar industry, you probably have a 25-year power purchase agreement. Wind industry, typically 15 to 25 years.
So you get 25 hours to 25 years.
Yes,
There's your problem.
There's a certain
right
amount of entrepreneurship involved with producing these products. In the chemical business, they have some fewer players, a better sense of what the medium-term pricing is, and that it's an opportunity for an offtake agreement that wouldn't be 100% of your revenue, might not even be 25%. But in terms of enough money to pay back the bank loan, to repay early investors, it could be the difference between actually building new technology into a new facility and not.
When we look at chemicals, in fuels, we've talked a lot about infrastructure incompatible, and then there's drop-in fuels. We're hearing more and more about this drop-in chemical. Are there any novel molecules out there that might have some traction that aren't necessarily drop-ins but have superior performance? Is there anyone out there that can make a better?
I'll mention one. It's a bit of a derivative, but plastics, $500 billion a year industry. There is a biomass that comes out of existing biofuels plants known as distiller's grain. These feed the animals. But interestingly enough, if you reform it into being a part of the plastic in flower pots, think of anything, a tree, vines, your typical nursery, that flower pot today is just petroleum based. If you put the protein from distiller's grain in that flower pot, University of Iowa has shown that you actually double the growth rate of the plant. You more than triple the fibrous roots of the plant. That's what enables it to grow quicker. And theoretically, you could actually just leave the pot in the ground, saving labor and time as you go and repot these things. And you're putting up an orchard. I just put up another 240 acres of almonds in my California ranch, for example, this year. This potting whole thing and how fast they grow and whether they're going to be strong is the key issue of the whole 25-year life cycle of the plant. And so value-added materials from this combination of biofuels and petrochemicals, I think is going to be a big part of the future.
So weird science, once again, Harry Potter, Pottersville out there. We're going to be potting all this, potting our way to profit. So.
And also another interesting thing that's happening, this mix of not versus, chemicals versus fuels, but chemicals and fuels, is take, for example, biogas production, right? So you take a renewable source, they say it's food waste, green waste, grass clippings, and you put in an anaerobic digester. It breaks it down, you produce methane and carbon dioxide. That could be converted to electricity, that can be converted to scrub out the carbon dioxide, make CNG, compressed natural gas, you can convert it to DME. And then in addition to that biogas that comes out, you also get fertilizer as well as some other products that could be composted. So you're seeing this mix. It's not really one versus the other, but it's very married together.
So the key word is and here's my and that's all the time we have. So thanks to Ron Cascone of Nexent for joining us tonight. Thanks to our regular panel, and we'll see you next time on The New Voices.